This week we talked about gender and sexuality. Instead of a lecture, we reviewed the documentary, The Gender Revolution. So let's take a few minutes to review the content of both that documentary and the lecture that was posted in our online content. The documentary this week encouraged us to think outside of the traditional binary with which we view gender, sex, and sexuality. It broke down the definitions of gender identity, which is how we as an individual identify our gender, and it's based on how we align with what we understand are the options for gender. So do we identify as woman, as man, as something in between, or a combination of the two? Gender expression are the ways with which we express our gender, kind of what it sounds like. So it has everything to do with how we dress, how we behave, our demeanor when we're interacting with others. Biological sex takes a look at the physical characteristics that we're born with, and this is where a lot of the conversation really was outlined in the documentary, because we run into trouble when we want to stick with the male-female binary, since there are 1 out of every 2,000 people who are born with both male and female biological attributes. Finally, we talked a little bit about the difference between our biological sex, our gender identity, and then those we are sexually attracted to. So if you think of the example for the couple who had been married for 40 years, and yet the woman does not identify as gay, she is not sexually or romantically attracted to women, yet she is attracted to her partner who happened to be a trans woman. So we took all of this information and we tried to roll it up into this cohesive conversation so we can begin to think outside of that binary description of woman, man, female, male, and who we are attracted to. This preliminary conversation about how we define gender and sex is incredibly important because we need to understand that gender is a social construction. So when we're talking about something being a social construction, we need to take a look at why it exists and how it came to be. Gender as a social construction really is made up of 3 separate pieces. It's made up of gender as a process, as a stratification system, and as, again, a structure. So gender as a process is really looking at and examining our day-to-day interactions that help reinforce gender as polar opposites. So for examples, what are the standards or the expectations when we're engaging with conversations of the same sex or opposite sex? What are our rituals in daily life? What are the things that we're able to say? A case in point would be, for instance, using the term "that's so gay" when we're talking about sexuality. That term is not usually used in a way that is positive in connotation. It's meant to be demeaning and degrading to those who identify as gay. So again, we go back to that conversation we started having at the very beginning of the semester about how language is power, and we use that power then to assert privilege over those that would have less power in society. Gender as a structure takes a look at how gender divides work in both the home and the economic spaces with which we operate. And what it does is legitimizes those in authority and organizes sexuality and emotional life. So a case in point here would be how we react to things like legislation around same-sex marriages, or what healthcare benefits are afforded to same-sex partners. Gender as a social construction is incredibly powerful when we start looking at stratification. We know that in our society in particular, and in fact in most areas of the world, men as a group have more status and power than women as a group. Women are the stigmatized other as compared to men. And so we can see this when we start taking a look at gender roles. For instance, in our country, boys have to be masculine, and that's defined as being active and aggressive. They have to be dominant. Girls have to be feminine, which means that they have to be soft and emotional and submissive. And while we're starting to see some change in this, it's not enough to impact the overarching systems that are in play that allow us to maintain our gendered institutions and our gendered stratification. It's important to remember that while roles and conversations can change over time regarding how we view gender and sex, let's remember that the sexual scripts that have been created to maintain some of those double standards that exist in our society are alive and well, and we see this through some of the um, current political conversations around things like the Me Too movement and the number of sexual harassment cases that have come to light. So while we are moving towards ideally a more equitable society as it relates to these things, there's still a lot of work to be done when it comes to understanding the lived experiences of marginalized groups, such as those who identify within the LGBTQ communities, as well as maintaining some of those more traditional understandings of kind of the men versus women lived experience. So let's take a second and see how theory applies to the conversation of gender and sexuality. And the first theory we'll take a look at, as usual, is the functionalism theory. And in this particular theory, when we're looking at issues around gender and sexuality, what we're talking about are the fact that men and women have distinct roles that ensure a family's and society's survival. So in this particular theory, we're saying that gender roles are complementary to one another, and that sexuality in particular is critical for reproduction. So it's functional in that we need it to perpetuate the human race. Now, in this theory, functionalists believe that sex outside of the marriage is dysfunctional because of the issues that arise from not having a two-parent household, and they encourage marriage somewhere between the mid to late 20s to ensure that that particular institution is maintained. A critical evaluation of functionalism when we're talking about gender and sexuality is that it doesn't take a look at the fact that working class and immigrant and minority women have played both an instrumental and expressive roles throughout our society. It also fails to acknowledge that the human capital model, one that's discussed in your book, assumes that women's lower pay is because of their choice. And we know that there's other data out there that would actually directly negate this particular assertion. It also says that what it doesn't say is that anti-gay discrimination is dysfunctional, yet when we look at all of the psycho-emotional and just the logistic data around discrimination, we can understand how negatively impactful that is for a society. The next theory we should talk about is the conflict theory. And within the conflict theory, what this particular theory asserts for this conversation is that sexuality reflects and perpetuates sexism and discrimination. And so here we're taking a look at the fact that capitalism explains gender roles and men's advantages over women. Gender equality gives men economic, political, and interpersonal power to control women's sexual lives. But one interesting issue with conflict theory as it relates to sexuality is that it asserts that women are powerless. And so, like men, women often barter to increase power, and this theory doesn't really take that into consideration. It also ignores the fact that women's exploitation of other women does in fact happen in society, regardless of the society you live in. And we'll see that with another theory in just a few moments here. The third theory that we're going to take a look at is the feminist theory. And in this particular theory, we know that emphasis is on women's subordination. That includes the daily vulnerability that exists, particularly as it relates to the male violence that's prevalent in our society. We also know from looking at this theory that gender, race, and social class intersect to form a incredibly strong stratification system. A criticism of this particular theory, though, is one that I just mentioned, and that is that it sometimes glosses over women's exploitation of others. It also doesn't pay a whole lot of attention to the parenting problems that males face in the home. And the final theory that we're going to talk about is the symbolic interaction theory. And this particular theory focuses on the everyday processes that produce and reinforce gender roles. So again, when we're talking about symbolic interaction, we're talking about how language, meaning, and thinking all come together to help inform our social construction, the lens with which we view our worlds. So in this theory, this is where we're specifically talking about the fact that gender and sexuality and the positive and negative stigmas that are associated with those things are socially constructed. We learn our gender roles through everyday interaction, and individuals learn how to express gender and sexuality differently over time and across cultures. Now, the criticism that comes with symbolic interactionism is that the social structures that create, maintain, or change gender roles and gender inequality are often ignored. We also see that there's the neglect that the relationship between biological factors and sexual orientation are taken into account. So for instance, when we talk about why identical twins can have different sexual orientations, this theory really doesn't go into that at all. So to wrap up, what we talked about this week was the fact that although sex and gender are used interchangeably, they are very different. Like race and class, gender and sexuality are multi-level systems of differences and disadvantages, and the inequalities that are experienced in these two realms are often tied to other inequalities. These inequalities can work together to produce differences among the various groups that we're talking about, and these differences are often reinforced through language. So that wraps up the wrap up for the conversation around gender and sexuality. Next week, we're going to be moving into conversations around race and ethnicity. Make sure you come to class having read all the content material and reviewed the online content so that we can engage in some more discussion. I'll see you guys next week.